On March 23, 2001, a mysterious website by the name of Ted's Caving Page would go up on a much earlier, archaic version of the internet we know today. This page baffled many people who stumbled across it, reading through update after update detailing Ted's experiences in a bizarre cave system he discovered in an undisclosed area. At first, his experiences seemed innocent enough, a passionate caver who wanted to explore uncharted territory, updating his followers with each step he took to accomplish just that. However, as things continued, the page would take a dark turn, as Ted soon realized that the cave system he opened never should have been explored in the first place. And then the page went dark, with updates from Ted ceasing entirely on May 19th, 2001. His last post detailed his experiences in the cave, as well as informing his readers that he intended to return there. Ted was never heard from again. The site I just described to you would later be known as Ted the Caver, and it would gain notoriety over the years for being the very first creepypasta, a kind of horror story or urban legend spread around the internet. And being the first of its kind, Ted the Caver was uniquely effective at accomplishing what it set out to do, immersing the reader in an unfiction. Because creepypastas were not yet widespread on this early version of the internet the story was posted to, many people debated about whether or not it was real. Some believed it to be a complete hoax, but others paid close attention to each update, legitimately believing that Ted was experiencing a real paranormal phenomena deep within the cave system. This unique immersion was greatly aided by the authenticity of the site itself. Ted would often post updates with long details about the cave and how it worked, making Mystery Cave feel like a real, tangible location. And on top of that, usually each update would contain photos from within the cave, showing Ted's progress as he worked towards opening an entrance to a location he called Floyd's tomb. At the time the story came out, it was a big deal, with many people discussing it and arguing about practically every aspect at play with it. However, despite its notoriety and the genre of internet horror it would help create, Ted the Caver would eventually fade into obscurity as more famous stories would be made in the years following. The story served its purpose, and everyone seemingly moved on. That being said though, 23 years later, this story started to experience a resurfacing of sorts. Many longtime creepypasta fans began reminiscing about Ted the Caver, making new videos and posts which explained why this story was so effective at the time it was released. And among these many fans who went out of their way to show their appreciation for Ted the Caver, one went above and beyond. Which leads me to the subject of this video.
I think it's on. That should be on. Alright. Cool. Hi. I'm Ted.
Ted's Caving Journal is a found footage adaptation of the original creepypasta, which only started posting about 3 months ago in December of 2023. And this found footage series right here may be the most faithful adaptation of any story I have ever seen. Each entry in this series shows us the exact events which were described on the original webpage, with each video being titled after the date of each page update and the videos being filmed on site in a real cave. This series was made with such an insane amount of passion for the original story that I just had to sit down and properly talk about it on here, because this is the kind of horror I admire the most on this platform. In this video, we are going to explore this series, taking a look at each of its entries and using the original creepypasta to fill in any potential blanks that may come up from the change in medium by which this story is being presented to us. If you at any point want to watch this series for yourself before we get into it, it will be linked in the description. Any support that can be provided to such a criminally underrated series would be appreciated. However, I do understand that many people have a hard time with horror and enjoy it more when there's someone there to help them get through it, so don't feel bad if you'd rather just let me explain it. Anyways, with our introductions out of the way, let's take a look at the dark mystery that is Ted's caving journal. Entry number 1, dated December 30th, 2000, introduces us to our cast of characters as well as the setting where this series entirely takes place. Our main character, Ted, introduces himself as well as his close friend who he simply refers to as B for the sake of anonymity. The reason Ted has begun recording a journal in the first place is because he and B, while spelunking, ended up discovering something fascinating. A hole located deep within a cave that seemingly leads to somewhere completely unexplored. This first entry is dedicated to properly establishing the characters and their relationship to one another, as well as taking us through the cave to show us where this hole is. And these two aspects make it abundantly clear what the strongest parts of this series are right off the bat: the presentation and the acting. These two characters are both portrayed perfectly by the actors that play them. There is a natural feeling to Ted and B throughout the entire thing that just really gives off the impression that these are just a pair of excited cavers that don't really know how to act in front of a camera, and it makes both of them very endearing to watch.
Me and a friend over there. That's the good old... What should I call you? Well, I mean, you said you want to be anonymous, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's B, I guess.
Why B?
Because it's the first letter. It's the first letter of your name. Okay.
The other big aspect I brought up earlier about what made this series work immediately for me was the sheer presentation of everything. The original Ted the Caver worked as well as it did because it felt very authentic. We were given vivid descriptions of the cave and proper photos of the work Ted and B were doing down there to make it feel real. I feel like a worse series would have recreated this by simply having these photos appear on screen like a slideshow of sorts, but Ted's Caving Journal goes out of its way to give us that experience by being filmed entirely within a real cave. We get to actually follow these two through a proper cave system which eerily mirrors that of the one described in the creepypasta, even down to there being a hole in the cave's walls which we can see them slowly work away at. Having this as the setting with the performances of the actors instantly immersed me within the unfiction this story is trying to present, which is very important when adapting this creepypasta because immersion was the entire point of it. Anyways, moving on. This entry ends with us arriving at the hole, which Ted says could lead to an entirely unexplored part of the cave that he refers to as Floyd's tomb, and explains that he and B will be spending the next couple of months working away at opening it up. Entry number 2, dated January 27th, shows us the beginning of this process, with Ted and B taking shifts working away at opening the entrance to Floyd's tomb. And it is at this point that I would like to bring up something that I personally love about this series that I feel will make it quite contentious with people. In the name of providing an authentic experience which reflects the events of each update in the original creepypasta, we spend a lot of time here. Seeing Ted and B work away at this entrance with some little detours happening every now and then. And when I say we spend a lot of time here, I mean we spend 4 full entries after the introduction video here. Now, I feel like this will be a point of contention for people because this is a very slow start where very little happens. There is your occasional moment of foreshadowing or subtle horror, which we will talk about in a moment, but for the most part, we spend half of this series watching these two work away at opening up the entrance to Floyd's tomb. If this is something that turns people away from the series, then I don't really blame them. I feel like there's a strong case to be made about why this slow start does a poor job at investing the viewer enough to keep them around for when things get scary. But allow me to make my own case as to why I actually would not change this and why I think it benefits the series. One thing that should be understood when going into Ted's caving journal is that it is not initially being presented as a horror project. Instead, it tries to sell us on the idea that this was a completely normal set of journal entries left behind by a pair of cavers only to become something terrifying as they made their way into the cave and learnt the true nature of it. They don't venture down there because of some suspicion of something terrifying lurking down in Floyd's tomb. They do it for the thrill of cave exploration, and the tapes exist as a way for the characters to share that thrill with the new viewers who may be interested. The horror comes in later, when they have already committed so much time to the project that their ambition clouds their better judgment when red flags start showing themselves. And in a weird way, that kind of reflects how I felt as a viewer watching these tapes back to back. I spent so much time watching these two work away, seeing how much effort went into making the tiniest bits of progress, and I found myself becoming more invested in just what would be down there by the time the series reached its climax. It felt like with every entry we were building towards something, and it made it so that when things finally did pick up and a proper threat was thrown into the mix, it was earned. That's why I think this slow burn approach works. If you disagree and lost interest early on, I can't exactly blame you, but I just wanted to put my thoughts on it out there since I've already had this discussion before with friends, and I think it's an interesting one to have. Now, as I mentioned prior, over the course of the time we spend in this cave seeing Ted and Bee work on the entrance to Floyd's tomb, there are quite a few occurrences that are worth noting. The first sign that something may be wrong inside the cave happens very early into their work, when Ted begins noting strange rumblings that happen on and off at random times. The two of them suspect that maybe it's coming from a draft or water passing through the cave, something natural that they can't exactly pinpoint. The second of these occurrences happens in the fourth entry dated February 10th, 2001, when Bee's dog Whip is taken into the cave. Aside from the insane detail of this dog being the same breed as the one shown in photos from the original creepypasta, the thing worth noting here is how uneasy Whip is the closer he's taken to Floyd's tomb. By the end of the entry, the dog is so on edge that it begins whimpering, which leads to Bee taking him home, ending the fourth entry. Now, these two occurrences can be taken as warning signs, yes, but neither of them would really be that big of a concern for someone who's working in this kind of environment. There are any number of ways you could brush them off as being completely normal and just continue working. What happens in entry number 5, though, is our first sign of real danger living within this cave. It opens as normal, with Ted explaining that Whip was not brought along this time out of fear of stressing the dog out more, and he and Bee immediately get back to work. At first, everything seems normal, but near the end, when Ted begins drilling into a side of the cave, this happens.
Ted. Fill the hole. Fill it now.
A scream echoes from deep within Floyd's tomb, confirming to both the viewer and to our cavers beyond a doubt that something is in the cave with them. Following this terrifying revelation, Ted is shaken up. He tries to continue working, but his nerves get to him, and soon after, the recording stops. Now, after hearing something like this, one would be left to wonder what would compel Ted and Bee to return back to the cave in the first place. And while the series gives us a good idea of it, the creepypasta elaborates on it a bit better with some of the notes left by Ted. They read, "My journal talks about the rest of the evening, our dinner, our decision to get a motel and come back the next day, our lengthy discussion on the strange sounds we heard, another mediocre night's sleep. I cannot believe that we were so willing to get right back into the cave after hearing the scream. Part of the reason I went along with the idea was because Bee seemed so indifferent to any possible dangers. Even if it were an animal, which I didn't believe but couldn't offer any better explanations, Weren't we possibly putting ourselves in harm's way? In retrospect, I still have difficulty understanding our thought process at the time. We were just too eager to discover virgin cave passages. I now think it can be summed up with one word: testosterone. It would seem as though the fear of what potentially was making that noise from within the cave was greatly overshadowed by Ted and Bee's enthusiasm for finally making their way into Floyd's tomb. And so we continue on to the next entry, which marks the beginning of the second half of the series. Entry number 6, dated March 4th, 2001. Entry number 6 begins with Ted and Bee finally creating a hole large enough for one of them to be able to crawl down into Floyd's tomb, with pretty much the entirety of the video after consisting of us watching the long, strenuous process that is crawling through it. The tomb is extremely narrow, forcing Ted to take long breathers in between each pull as he descends deeper. As he reaches the bottom, he finds that there is an opening just barely too small for him to properly enter the cave that lies beyond the tomb, and so he makes the same exhausting crawl back up to the top, and the video ends. This entry was short but sweet, and it really highlighted an aspect of this series that I hadn't really mentioned before. That being the fact that the setting itself is really terrifying regardless of whether or not a monster is in there with them. Part of the reason I latched onto this series and the original creepypasta so strongly is because I have always had a strong fear of anything related to caves, and this video in particular really highlights why. The claustrophobic feeling of seeing someone crawl through a natural passageway not meant for them spikes my anxiety far worse than any simple monster can. And it's especially bad with the dramatic irony of knowing that if something is alive down there waiting for Ted, that slow, excruciating crawl through Floyd's tomb is his only method of escape. Some really terrifying stuff to think about. Anyways, moving on, our next entry, dated April 7th, 2001, shows us our first glimpse into what lies beyond Floyd's tomb. The entry begins with Ted working away at opening the exit to the tomb with a pair of tools he crawled down with, before finally creating a hole large enough to fit through. Passing through it, he now finds himself exploring a cave system that has never been seen before. A cave system that can only be described as wrong. From the moment he steps foot in here, something about this place feels off. The walls of the cave are lined in a moist material that Ted himself describes as being like a wax of sorts. Everything is damp and the placement of the rocks appear unnatural as stated by Ted himself.
Wait. There's a... oddly placed rock.
Perhaps the strangest thing he encounters down here, however, is a hieroglyph which can be seen scratched onto a wall. A hieroglyph that Ted does not recognize. Now in the video series, we don't really get much information about this hieroglyph or anything Ted saw alongside it. However, the creepypasta actually elaborates further, with Ted going as far as to provide his own drawing of it. Ted's description of the hieroglyph is as follows. I remember what the hieroglyphics looked like, so I drew a picture to give you an idea of what I saw. It's a crude drawing, but it's accurate. The first thing I thought when I saw it was Blair Witch Project. It kind of has the same feel to it. This symbol was in the center and several figures that looked like people raising their hands were below this. After finding this strange drawing on the walls, Ted decides to call it quits for the day and begins crawling back through Floyd's tomb to tell Bee about what he found down there. Everything goes as expected until about halfway through his crawl where out of nowhere he hears something. strange noise can briefly be heard echoing through the cave's walls just loud enough to catch Ted off guard. He stops moving for a moment, frantically looking around to try and discern what it could be, and then it suddenly comes to a stop. Ted, now shaken up, rushes to get out of Floyd's tomb, with it being described in his notes that he ended up getting some bad scrapes along his body as a result. This video doesn't tell us much about what the sound was. However, the entry that follows, as well as the creepypasta, describes it with significantly more detail. The excerpt from Ted's journal reads, "I was a little over halfway through when something bizarre happened. I was lying there, taking a brief break, when I heard a sound deep within the cave. It was the faint but distinct sound of rock sliding on rock. My blood froze in my veins. I couldn't move. I just lay there, straining to hear the sound again. Nothing. I quickly began to scoot towards the exit. I didn't mention the sound to B, but I did recall one of our earlier trips when B said he heard the same thing. It would seem as though the reason for the irregular placement of the rocks was because of something down there actively moving them when Ted and B weren't around to see it. A disturbing detail that Ted would keep from B for reasons unknown until the next entry in the series." Speaking of which, entry number 8, dated April 14th, 2001, gives us the introduction of a new and very important character to this story. Joe, a professional caver that Ted had brought along with him to show his discovery to. Joe is this eccentric, excited individual who seems to share Ted's passion for caving and even brings up having explored the mystery cave in the past, never running into any hole that would have led to Floyd's tomb. The two of them make their way through the cave system towards said tomb, briefly stopping along the way so they can talk about what Ted heard in the last video.
Hey, Ted.
Yeah?
Just a quick question. Shouldn't we tell him?
What? Tell him what? B, listen, I don't think... Listen, tell him the wind stopped, that we heard something. Listen, I don't feel like we're putting him in any sort of danger ourselves, right? We don't feel like we're in any sort of danger, and I think that's fine. So I think I'm going in there with him, all right? That's why we wanted another person. That's okay, all right? I think it'll be fine, okay?
Okay.
It seems that Ted wants to keep quiet about the sounds he's been hearing, as he doesn't believe there to be any real danger within the cave, so he sees no point in bringing it up and potentially scaring his caving partner over nothing. After this exchange, Joe and Ted continue through the cave, arriving at Floyd's tomb when suddenly an accident occurs. Ted, who has been going through this entire series without proper caving equipment like a helmet, ends up hitting his head against the cave hard, which causes him to begin bleeding quite badly. There is a bit of an argument about what to do, with it eventually being decided that Ted will stay back to tend to his wounds, while Joe goes ahead to check out the part of the cave that lies beyond Floyd's tomb. And this is where things take a major turn for the worst. The first sign of something wrong happens when Ted and B take notice of the draft coming from Floyd's tomb, suddenly stopping right around the point that Joe should have gotten out. And yet, there is no sign of him. The two begin to panic, running towards the entrance and calling out his name until eventually they see the light of his flashlight approaching. For a brief moment, they're just relieved to see their friend okay, but then they notice that the Joe who left the cave was not the same person they entered with.
Joe, come on. Come on, man. Come on, B, help him up. Help him up, B. Joe, are you okay?
Oh, God.
What happened to you? Joe, are you okay?
No.
What do you mean? Wait, what? No, what do you mean? No. Did you see the hieroglyphs, the rock, the cave? Did you get in?
No.
What? No. Why are you bleeding? What happened? Joe, are you okay? What happened to you? Joe, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. B, what do we? B, Joe, I'm so sorry.
I'm gonna go.
Where are you gonna go?
I'm gonna go.
Joe exits the tomb in a delirious state, covered from head to toe in blood. He's barely responsive, and when asked about what happened, he simply trails off to leave the cave. This moment freaked me out a lot. It's another prime example of the actors absolutely selling the immersion of the series. It isn't scary because of any overt danger or loud jump scares. Instead, it lets the horror come purely from the reactions of the characters to whatever happened to Joe when he entered the cave. You can feel the genuine panic from Ted and Bee, who are just scared for their friend to experience something beyond any of their comprehension. The creepypasta adds on to this in a way the video never shows us, with Ted going into further detail about the state they found Joe in. He explains, "Once we got outside the cave, I figured we'd be able to find out more from Joe. But when he got up to the final climb, he just unclipped from the rope and went straight to the truck. In the light of day, he looked even worse than in the cave. Bee and I gathered up the rope and our gear and headed for the truck. Joe said he did not want to stay overnight because he felt terrible, and we believed him. So we headed home. We could get no more information from Joe. He just stared straight ahead. He was shaking like a leaf, and he said he was not cold. When we tried to question him, his answers were short. I asked him if he saw the hieroglyphics. No. Did he hear us yelling? No. Did he see the round rock? No. Did he see the crystals? No. He said he just went a little ways in and started to feel sick. Something was fishy about his answers. He would have had to have seen the crystals if he got far enough into the cave that he couldn't hear us yelling. But why would he not elaborate? The rest of the trip passed in eerie silence. Joe didn't say much else. We gave him a brief outline of the strange events that happened in the cave. He didn't reply. As we were dropping him off, we asked if he wanted to go back into the cave. He shook his head and ran into his house. I tried to call him later in the day and the next day, but only got his voicemail. Whatever was down there traumatized Joe in a way that we never see him recover from. Because after this entry, he is never seen again. The final video that is currently out in the series explains as much, with Ted talking about how all means of contacting Joe no longer worked and how he seemingly just vanished. After explaining what happened to Joe, the final video properly starts. The entry is dated April 28th, 2001, and canonically happens over the course of the second last update that ever happened on the creepypasta, which means that there is still one entry that is yet to be released. At the beginning of this video, we are given the rundown as to what Ted plans for the future. Tonight, despite everything that happened to Joe, he intends to return to Floyd's tomb alongside Bee. He explains that his reasoning for wishing to return to that place despite all the obvious signs of danger is because of one sole factor: the time and effort that has gone into exploring it over the last couple of months. Whether they like it or not, this cave has effectively been Ted and Bee's life for the better part of 4 months, and after all this time, they aren't ready to just turn back and leave it behind despite everything telling them they should. And so, they descend into the cave one last time, giving us the climax that the entire series has built up to. Ted descends into Floyd's tomb, entering the cave behind it and exploring every crevice of it. At first, things are quiet, much like the first time down there. However, things quickly turn for the worst when we hear the familiar sound of stone sliding against stone.
Where's the light? Why is it not working?
Ted is badly injured when the boulder impacts his head and he loses his light source. The scenes that follow show Ted in a blind panic, trying his hardest to reorient himself within the cave, looking first for a new light source and then for the camera. He calls B using a walkie-talkie, but no one answers, leaving him completely alone to fend for himself with whatever it was that moved the boulder. Ted manages to pull out a survival glow stick, which he tosses into the center of the room as a way to mark his surroundings, a plan which would have worked if not for this. Something is down there with him, a revelation which triggers Ted's fight or flight response. He blindly runs to one end of the cave, hoping desperately to find an exit, before briefly stopping and listening to his surroundings. Ted finds the exit to Floyd's tomb and begins hastily crawling his way back up, ripping apart the skin along his arms and back with each painful movement he makes. As he attempts to slow his breathing to fit through the tight cave passage, he notices the stench. The smell of rotting corpses which has now flooded the entire cave. The stench, as well as his panic, cause his breathing to become erratic, leading to several painstaking moments where he becomes trapped in the small passageway before regaining his composure. By the time he escapes Floyd's tomb, we can see that he's now covered in his own blood from the sheer amount of cuts all over his body, a detail we are not able to linger on as he continues to make his way out of the cave, screaming for B to pack up their gear and run. He attempts to follow, but suddenly trips as he feels something pulling on his caving rope. Whatever is down there now tugs on his rope, the only piece of equipment that will allow him to leave the cave. He picks up the pace, making his way to the cave's entrance and shouting to B to climb out before the video abruptly cuts, bringing an end to what is currently out for Ted's caving journal. Do I even need to describe why this entire sequence is so viscerally terrifying to watch unfold? Not really, but I'm going to anyway, cause you know how I am. What is presented at the end of this video is one of the single most horrifying scenarios I can possibly imagine. Being trapped in a dark cave system with some unknown threat pursuing me, knowing that the only exit is so tight and claustrophobic that you can get stuck when trying to crawl through it. This climax presents us with such a panic-inducing scenario that not much else is even needed to make it scarier. You probably noticed that we never really see this monster, and there aren't any intense jump scares or loud sounds. The scene works as well as it does purely because of the context, which made me think about what would happen if I were in Ted's shoes. It's a nightmare that nobody could ever imagine living through, and yet here it is, realistically depicted for all of us to watch, with no clear resolution even shown at the end of the video. This is the kind of horror that really affects me, the kind that plays off of small subtleties to immerse the viewer, the kind that forces your imagination to run wild with what could possibly be going on. It frightened me so deeply that it led to the video you're watching right now, and I cannot think of a better way to end the series. Now, like I said, this is not actually where the creepypasta ends. Although in terms of its horror, this is the point that the entire story was building to. The original creepypasta ends with Ted giving an account of his life after his trip to the cave. The sleepless nights, the intense paranoia, and eventually, the morbid curiosity. Ted makes one last post announcing to his followers that he intends on returning to the cave one last time with a weapon in hand, desperate to know the truth of what attacked him that night. And then the page goes dark, with updates from him coming to a complete stop. We never find out what became of Ted, whether he survived or became another victim to whatever made its home down there. Once again, we're left with our imaginations to fill in the blanks, bringing an end to one of the most immersive creepypasta experiences. If I were to take an educated guess, I'm assuming that in the near future, we will be seeing a similar ending to the analog horror series. A video log from Ted telling us that he intends to return to the cave, only for all uploads to completely stop on the channel. And if that is the case, then I feel it would be the perfect ending to what is already a perfect adaptation. Ted's Caving Journal succeeds not only as being an amazing adaptation of a classic creepypasta, but also just a fantastic horror series in general. It's able to recapture all the same immersion and atmosphere that made the creepypasta work in a way that we've never really been able to see. It is clear from every entry that there is an insane amount of love and passion poured into this project, and I admire it so much for that. It deserves all the attention it has recently received and far more, and it is my honest hope that this video will help that happen. It is a series that absolutely deserves your time and attention, and I cannot recommend enough that you go and give it that if you haven't already. Anyways though, that will be all from me for now. I hope you enjoyed this video even half as much as I enjoyed making it. I can't wait to see you here for whatever my next project ends up being. Goodbye for now.